Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midnight Thoughts podcast, where we talk about the indie film world and all that it entails. Horror tells a big part of film history. It crosses continents, cultures, and you will hear that indie films had a big part in reinventing this genre, or blowing fresh air in a saturated market. It's going to be long because I really wanted to put everything, or at least as much as I could, into this podcast. So put on your headphones and relax. Here is the history of horror. Well, it all started with stories that have been going on since the dawn of human history. They were scary stories that were passed down from generation to generation, all hobbled up, told around a campfire. And most of these stories actually were supernatural folklore, and this eventually got into books and spread around the world. So, with such a precedented history, it's no surprise that when the new format film came around, the genre horror immediately got its foot in the door. Throughout cinema history, horror has had many peaks, many ups and downs, but where will that lead us today, and the future, and how that we actually get there? Well, the beginning. It all started, as with most innovations in film, it started with Georges Méliès. He was a French filmmaker and was one of the first to actually make films. He is known as the father of special effects, and any film lover needs to know this name. He made this film called A Trip to the Moon. Most of you will probably know this scene. It's where this bullet-shaped rocket ship goes towards the moon, and it's like this iconic shot of him, of the moon's face, and then getting the bullet in its eye. And he actually made horror in 1898. It was complete with cauldrons, animated skeletons, ghosts, transforming bats, and ultimately even an incarnation of the devil. Of course, this was a silent film, and it wasn't really intended to be scary. It was more wondrous because the guy, Georges Méliès, was actually a magician by trade and then got into filmmaking. To this day, it is the first example of horror we really know, and it was actually rediscovered in 1977 because a lot of the films that he made were completely destroyed and disappeared. He even destroyed a lot of them himself out of an anger outburst. But in 1900 and towards 1920, the literary year started, and this was mainly because the filmmakers were still trying things out in this new genre. So they used books and etc. as source material. Think of Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the werewolf, and these are things that we've all pretty much seen, maybe even read, because they've been remade so many times. And if you haven't seen the older classics, it's really good to go and see these, because Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I actually recently saw that one, and it really blew my mind by the performance, because when you think of these silent films, you often think it's really boring, and the pace is a little slow, but it's actually, it's a good watch. And especially these films weren't really long, because the story was usually quite short, mainly short stories, so they were like 10 to 12 minutes long. And often enough, big names, like they already got like big actors, and big names were joined in this film. And this was done in 1913. They made a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film. And in 1920, they actually made a bigger production version of it, with special effects and even a more elaborate story, because the 10 to 12 minutes didn't really do justice to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Alright, so after 1920, the golden age of horror began, and there were two more silent films which were produced that actually did unsettle the audience. The previous ones were just, they were for show, to see what the fuck is film. But now that people kind of know film, they want something more out of it than just like a fucking moving train. These two films that did unsettle the audience were The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. And the latter was actually Rotten Tomatoes' second reviewed horror film of all time, or still is. Now, the silence were no more after this, and the talkies began. Massive films paved the way for generations to come, particularly in the monster movie field. And now think of iterations of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy. After all this, until the late 1940s, Gothic horror would dominate the cinema screen. Now, in 1932, during the Golden Age, Paramount Pictures decided to film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde again, this time with noise, with talking, and it took every morning 3 hours to apply the makeup, which is a pretty funny story. But he did actually win the Oscar for Best Actor, and he was the first actor to actually win the Oscar in the horror genre. And this is the time that also the first time horror would be defined as an actual genre, because previously it was romance melodrama with a dark element. And this also spawned the first horror stars, with Bela Lugosi to be the first to be playing Dracula. If you look up Dracula, if you think of Dracula, you probably think of this guy, because he was the first one to do it, or at least the first one to do it well. Now, at this time, the genre also started to worry the general public, with heavy censoring, and public outcry becoming common with each release. Freaks from 1932 is a great example, where it got cut so extensively because the film was so shocking, with the original to be never found again. But the film has aged well after all these years, and it still actually is pretty scary to watch. Now, during the golden age of horror, the Monster Mash series was a huge, with Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Wolfman, and even more to star in the same movie. This was all made by Universal Studios, who were the king of big blockbuster movies. But in the 1940s, the view on horror started to change a little bit, with RKO making lower budget films. They decided to focus a little more on the psychological effects, mainly because they didn't have the huge budget for sets, and that made it a little more important to have the tone and the mood very scary. Now, they used old sets instead of building their own, and the producer Val Luden gave the titles. And he would use the titles, but the filmmaker would make a completely different film. And these movies introduced completely new ways of storytelling in the horror genre, such as not showing the monster and having a long silence before something scary, and afterwards a loud noise. This is pretty much a horror technique that everybody uses nowadays. The next age we call the atomic age, because people were afraid of atomic bombs, and thus those old monster films weren't really relevant anymore. People were more afraid of the real life. In the next film, horror movies began to feature less supernatural monsters, but monsters that had a more realistic motivation behind them, such as a radioactive mutation. And this became a very, very common theme, and this was the era of B-movies. There were a radioactive mutation influenced monsters such as Godzilla, massive spiders, aliens coming from the sky. It also was a very popular theme. They also made a movie called The Tingler, where William Castle turned the cinema even fucking crazier. They used vibrators in the chair, actors in the cinema pretending to faint, and to fight off little monsters. So imagine that in your cinema. This is back when cinemas were a lot of fun. They had drive-ins, 3D glasses, live performances, and now during the atomic age, many films weren't really scary. They were more just for fun. And this is where a company called Hammer Studios from Britain came in. They started to make a completely different kind of monster film, and they put the horror back into horror, and again using already existing monsters such as Frankenstein, but now with color and blood and sex. These films also took a very different approach to the main character. such as, for example, in Frankenstein, it used to be always focused on the monster itself, but this time it was focused on the scientist. So it is a little bit more of a smarter horror film. In the 1960s, elaborate gothic thrillers were made. They were really big, and these films produced by Hammer Studios absolutely dominated the cinemas, and this moved well into the 70s. Movies like Peeping Tom and Psycho are amazing examples of this, and made the world get an appetite for horror slashers. Psycho was made by Alfred Hitchcock. He's a legendary filmmaker, and I hope every single one of you guys knows who the fuck this guy is. He's known as the master of suspense and is one of the greatest directors of all time. Now, let's continue. This insatiable appetite for gore and slasher films created a stream of low-budget slasher films, and most of these films were pretty bad. But in 1968, an indie film called Night of the Living Dead came out, which was the first film to show actual gruesome acts, like stabbing and flesh getting eaten, and it will become a huge turning point in horror and movies in general, because nowadays horror films always have these very realistic scenes where you see someone actually getting killed, and this was the first movie to do it. It was also very innovative because they leaded a black character, which was completely unheard of at the time, and this was an independent film, and it was also one of the first independent films that would gain worldwide popularity. And the film also created an entire subgenre, the movie flick. So I think everyone should watch this film. It was just, as I said, a huge turning point in film. And a funny story about it is that the director could have sold the film to a major Hollywood studio, but they wanted him to change the ending and add a love story, and he refused to do this, and so he always stayed in the indie world, because he is a true filmmaker and always in pursuit of his own vision. Now, a new trend emerged in the 70s with an obsession with the religious evil, and that even to this day is still a popular subgenre. It all started with The Exorcist, and this film is one that you should definitely see. It's always referred to as the scariest movie ever made, and if you agree with it or not, it is true horror, and it's even won Oscars and Golden Globes. After it came The Omen in 1976, and this fueled the genre even more. Now, a trope that was really popular in the 80s were the slasher films, and this arguably got kicked off by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974. I watched this movie last night, and it's not a gore fest as you would expect, and there are definitely moments when it's really scary and gives you like this tingly feeling in your stomach, especially at the end. But in my opinion, the story was a little weak. It went a little slow, and there was too much fucking screaming in there. So, I mean, you watch it for the sake of watching it, but it's not the best film out there, in my opinion. But some people absolutely fucking love it, so don't take my word for it. Go and see it yourself. Now, by now, the whole genre of horror is pretty much fragmented into a lot of different subgenres, with religious evil and slasher films being the most popular ones at the time. Also, Jaws made the animal horror really popular, including the whole cycle of shark movies. And we all know these kind of films like Sharknado. I remember seeing this film with they were like little fish. What the fuck are they called? They're called piranhas. And that movie was fucking crazy and really disgusting. It built on previous trends that I'm gonna talk about later today. One trend is like the trend where this beast is stuck inside of you. It's one of these trends that started somewhere in the 80s. And there's this whole thing with this animal horror movies. So it kind of combined these two. It was something with fucking flesh-eating piranhas that they came from prehistoric times and got out because of this earthquake. But yeah, I went off a little bit, but by now, in the late 1970s, big blockbuster films would dominate the cinemas. And then Halloween came out, which was an independent film and super low budget, and it became one of the most successful independent films of all time. Alien also came out in 1979 and included all the elements of a slasher film. And these two films really, became really fucking big and also had multiple franchises after them. And this really put the slasher film right on the forefront of horror. And as I mentioned before, there was this huge shitty wave of low budget films that ended up making millions. So it was like kind of 1 out of 10 films of these shitty horror films that would come out would make millions. And this just got bigger and bigger throughout the 70s. Paramount Pictures wanted as much as any studio a piece of this, and so in 1980 they did it with Friday the 13th, which pretty much was a clone of Halloween with a little less story and even more gore. And these are good films to watch, especially Halloween on Halloween. At least I'll be watching it. So this all influenced the film franchise wave, where movies would endlessly be milked with sequel after sequel. I mean, fuck quality and fuck continuity. This created horror icons like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, Michael Myers, all in the 80s. VHS itself created a completely new market and made this video nasty type of genre, which was a new completely type of horror movie, and this focused completely on gore and thrills. These kind of films never really saw the light of a theater because they were usually just too disgusting and they lived in the basement of teenagers mostly. Now at the end of the 80s, the slasher film genre kind of ran out of steam, and into the 90s it became a little more a parody of itself, and it really recognized all the stupid cliches, which made it really self-aware. Movies like Brain Dead and Scream became overnight successes. And in the 1990s, horror changed the whole cinema once again with The Blair Witch Project, which again was an indie film. And it used the found footage technique for the first time in cinema history. The indie film had only a small budget of like $60,000, which is really, really impressive, and it became one of the biggest indie films ever made. This influenced many films to do the same afterwards, and I bet you that you've seen some of them. In the 2000s, many horror films, with a few exceptions of course, was mainly formulaic, with a lot of found footage films, along with a comeback of splatter films like Saw, and this was named torture porn. And now a whole slew of uninspiring remakes came along, with almost every classic to be remade, and this went well into the 2010s. And with classics, I mean films again like Dracula and Frankenstein, these kind of films. I bet you've seen at least one of them. Now, although there were a few films that breathed new life into the genre, like Cabin in the Woods and Babadook. And even more recently, we have films like Get Out and Us by Jordan Peele, and he gave the genre, in my opinion, some completely new and original ideas. And he coupled it with excellent writing. It didn't just rely anymore on those stupid jump scares, because that's what I used to always hate about horror films. No, he actually makes the movie scary all throughout the film. And that is just going with that clever writing, and it just makes it generally scary, but with modern subjects. I at least absolutely loved it, and I would definitely recommend you to see at least one of these films. And this kind of concludes our history of horror. I mean, we have started with the 1900s, the literary years, where the filmmakers were just trying things out, and the name horror wasn't even a thing. Then in the golden age of horror, the films actually started to unsettle some people. We got into the talkies, where they started experimenting even more with gothic horror and a little bit more scary. It started toward the general public, something that movies nowadays don't really do anymore. It's video games that usually get a little slack these days. It's pretty funny how that just translates into whatever is new, just because people don't understand it. Just like the same thing back then. And so yeah, I would say go and watch a few of these videos that I've mentioned before, these films. They're really interesting to see, especially if you just love film and just want to see a kind of a little bit of the history of horror. I always would suggest just start where I started and then go along with it and just watch those films. So this concludes it. I hope everyone has a wonderful October. It's raining, it's super nice, the weather is nice. Have a good time, have yourself a little cup of coffee and relax. I'll see you guys later in the next episode. I don't really know what it's gonna be about yet, but we'll see. Alright guys, by the way, follow me on Twitter. It's just called Midnight Thoughts. And yeah, have a good time. Later guys.